Hello and welcome. I'm Somesh Verma. Let's consider some data today. In this world, every 5 seconds, one child under the age of 5 dies from hunger or malnutrition-related disease. Every 4 minutes, one person loses his or her eyesight for the lack of vitamin A. More than 852 million people globally do not get enough food each day to sustain a normal life. Sometimes it makes you wonder, is everybody equal? Is right to food not for everyone? Does human rights have much meaning if it's not for everyone? Can we imagine a world free of hunger in which every woman, man and child can fully enjoy their human rights in dignity, particularly the right to adequate food? To talk about these, today we have two guests in our studio. Dr. Anna Maria, who is FIAN International Representative in Geneva, and Dr. Keshab Khadka, an economist. Welcome to our show.
Hello.
Can we start with Anna?
Yeah.
How do you define right to food? Because we know, as we speak, a lot of people across the world are hungry.
Yeah. So we talk as food as a right when we say that everyone should have the possibility to claim to the state for them to have access to adequate food which is available all the time in a sustainable manner. That sounds quite complicated, but the most important thing is that states should respect the right of people, which means they should not interfere when people already have the way to have their food, to have their income. Second, they should protect people, which means if others like non-state actors, business companies, landlords, come and impede that people feed themselves, the states should regulate, protect, monitor, or even sanction those actors. And third, the state should fulfill, which doesn't mean giving food. It's not the idea of providing food, but it's the idea of putting all the measures necessary to ensure that people can feed themselves. And just for those who are not able to feed themselves, you or the state would have the obligation to provide adequate food within a strategy, which means that you shouldn't make people dependent of this food aid or food assistance, but give them the food until they are able to feed themselves. And for that, states should adopt strategies.
We'll move to Keshab. Dr. Keshab, do you think a country like Nepal has enough capacity to do this?
Thank you. And that enough capacity, how to define?
Exactly, that's your job.
Of a state. That's the problem. If you take the things as a liability of a state, then every citizen has a right from the very birth to claim over his livelihood with the state, because he is a citizen. And citizen's livelihood or citizen's life is the prime thing the state should care. But regarding, as Anna has already explained, it is not the duty of the state to provide food for everyone, but create a condition. Sometimes, in the Nepalese condition, the food production is not the problem. We have sufficient food. But the problem is the access, the social mapping,
How do we differentiate here?
Yeah.
Access to food, when, we say that there's enough food for everyone, yet people are going hungry.
Yeah.
How does it come about?
Yeah. Because there is the, socio-economic factors leading to that thing. The access to resources, food producing resources, or the enough income, or the employment generation. There are so many things which affect the access. Access means there are two types of access. One is economic and another is social. Sometimes we have economic access means you should have enough means to purchase the food required for your livelihood or for your standard life, and that purchasing power, the capacity enhancement of that purchasing power, it is related with the economic aspect of access to food. At available food price, you should have that much income or that much resource that you can buy food. Another is social access. And social access is the most important thing in our context, because we have different social hierarchies on the one hand, and the economic resources are, sometimes correspond to the different social hierarchies. closer to the state power you are, or in a beneficial position, then you have better resources than the otherwise.
So it brings in a question, should this happen to food? I mean, just because I'm more powerful, I have access to food, and somebody who's less powerful doesn't have access to food.
That's what we are trying to avoid from the human rights approach. We don't want to get away to anybody the food they have, but we want to avoid that people abuse, and that can be state actors.
So basically we're talking about, I have enough, so I waste a lot. You don't have, so you don't get at all.
Yeah, that's one thing. But the other thing is that many times also people are victims of other people who are getting them away the resources they need, for example, food, and that's not necessary in the same country. It can also be that foreign investors come to Nepal and decide to put a huge hotel in the best places, and all the people who are living there and having their livelihoods there are evicted, and then they do not have any possibility to continue.
Normally it happens in case of big dams, and when these are constructed, you see a lot of farmers being displaced and put in an area where they cannot grow anything, and they eventually their means of earning and eventually means of having food is diminished.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So are we talking about that?
Exactly. And what we normally hear is that every country is responsible for the people living in their country. That's like the domestication of human rights. But in fact, it creates a gap of protection, because more and more in the world, in the globalized world, you have situations where many countries or many actors are involved. You can, for example, have a Swiss hedge fund investing in a project from Indian enterprises building a dam between India and Nepal, and on the end affecting the indigenous people from Nepal. So that's why we are trying at FIA not.
So this basically means that let's talk about, if we're talking about India and Nepal, for example, India also has obligation to people of Nepal.
Yeah.
But normally this is not in practice. Can we force this?
Exactly. The problem is that after the Second World War, we were thinking in international categories. And more the situation was being reduced to a state with their own inhabitants. What we are trying to do now is to create at international level, in international law, in regional law, and in national law, the rules that we need to make, for example, in this case, Indians responsible for violations that they are causing to people living in Nepal. The problem is that in many cases it's not just one country, so you can have the money coming from the USA, from Switzerland, the Indian investors, some Nepali officers which are implied, and it means you have to have a broad regulation which allow us to make all responsible. Saying that India is responsible doesn't mean getting away the responsibilities that the Nepali authorities could have in the case. For example, if they give a concession without having impact assessment on what would happen with the people if they give this contract to the investors coming from other countries, and so on. And that's why we are working on what we call the extraterritorial obligations of states in the area of economic, social, and cultural rights, trying to have adequate law at international level, but also remedies so that people can claim, in this case of the dam, for example, in Nepal, but also in India, or maybe at the UN.
Dr. Keshab, I'd just like to come to you. Normally, states would think about the benefits. It's also always about revenues. Like we talked about, let's say, a big multinational company coming to Nepal, maybe near the border town. All Nepali government would be concerned about getting revenue, whereas this might create an implication for Nepali people there, as well as Indians on the border side. Yeah. How easy is it to negotiate there?
Oh, that's a tricky,
I mean,
diplomatic question.
First thing is, it is difficult to negotiate with Nepali government first, for Nepali people who would be suffering. And eventually, even Indian government would need to negotiate with Nepal for their own people. How easy is this?
It is not a matter of whether it is easier or hard. That depends on diplomatic maneuvering. The fact is that any kind of activity should not lead to a condition where the traditionally food resources are reduced. when the traditionally available food are restricted because of that development activity. Sometimes just Maria was referring to that Lakshmanpur Bandh, which we have been very much well-known case, and your popular media has also raised so many issues. Because it is not the bad thing that India should have a good barrage and get irrigation and more food for the Arab people. That's her duty. But while she is discharging this duty, she should also take care of the upper riparian country, Nepal, and our people. Because of that afflux bond, the paddy fields in Nepalese side should not get drowned, and the crops rotten. So that's the extraterritorial obligations which we
Is it not very
so that
difficult?
means
And it also looks very complicated, doesn't it?
No, it is not complicated. While you are initiating some project like
But
that,
I think it's
then-
very complicated
then-
when it comes to negotiating.
No, that negotiation is at the very much inception period, because if you get the idea that there is right of the people, ESCR, economic, cultural and social rights should not be disturbed due to this activity. If you got that idea while it is at the initial period,
Fair enough. There's nothing denying that
Yeah.
you cannot harm the rights of
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
right to food.
Yeah.
But I'm just asking, maybe Anna can explain here, that is it not complicated when it comes to implementation?
I think it is very complicated because we have like contradictory commitments in our governments. On one part, we have countries which have signed the international obligations, treaties, saying we commit to respect human rights, dignity, especially for those marginalized or disadvantaged. And on the other side, we have officers who just are thinking on how to make business. So at some point, to bring these both together makes the situation very difficult, and more difficult when you have 2, 3, 4 actors interested in the business.
I'm asking this because traditionally we have states which are used to making wars. We still have conflicts in many regions of the world where one conflicting party would try to harm all the interests of the other conflicting party. So how easy can it be? I mean, whatever you're saying, I'm not denying that, but the problem is it sounds all too good to be true, doesn't it?
It is, but it is not, because we already have some cases when we have had good precedents. For example, we have the so-called Oiskadi case. This was a case in which European investors had a company, the cars, wheels, in Mexico. And at some point they decided to close the company, letting 2,000 people without work, which means without food for their and their families. And then we began doing lobby and advocacy work with the German parliament and with the European parliament and putting pressure, and some of our members bought shares in the assembly of the company. And when the shareholders noted that this company let people without food, they decided to reopen the company, and they decided to pay all the debts they had to the workers with the help of the company. And now these people have again the work. So in the big context of war, and so of course it's difficult, but we can tackle some issues.
Dr. Keshab, you can explain this. Probably we're talking about a few cases. There are, and in recent years, starting 2008, where we have entire world seems to be in recession. Most of the companies, they're closing down their wings in various developing worlds, which leads to eventually people without work and, of course, without food. This example sounds good, but how realistic is this in case of entire global perspective?
In global perspective, we are living in a completely new world. You are right that in the past there are some mishappenings or wars between the states, and even today it is not free of all these things. But in spite of all these things, we are living in a completely new world in the sense that the multinational corporations, the mobility of people across the border, and all these economic activities depending on economic cooperation, sometimes economic partnership, so that one part of the things of same manufacturing goes in one country and another in home country, and this type of things are there. So it is the beauty of globalization, or globally we are one community-like thing. So in this change perspective, if we think the traditional way, how to resolve things by force or using these all things, then naturally we will lead to a zero condition.
So the whole idea is redefine the problem,
Yeah,
find new
redefine.
solutions.
This extraterritorial obligation, it is redefined. It is simply the maneuvering of, I think, the intellectuals, you know, from 40 or more than 40 universities in Maastricht.
We're trying to envision a world
a
without
new, they are inventing a new kind of paradigm so that we can live, we can harmonize our resources.
That sounds very positive.
To protect
But I'll
human
just come
rights.
to Anna because we're running out of time. Who are biggest villains? The states or the multinationals?
So from the human rights approach, you always talk about states being the violators, but now we cannot close the eyes and say many of the breaches have been caused by activities of transnationals. Of course, not every company is a violator. We should have that clear. But more and more we see that in specific areas as agribusiness or extractive industries, all the mines, more and more the companies are, and we could say that they are in complicity relationship with states. So, and have power over many states. So
because these
to say
transnational
one or the other is
companies
difficult
normally have
because
such a
they are
big clout
together.
that they influence the state, and there are a lot of monetary kickbacks. We've known of this.
So that's why we are looking in our very difficult work, as you mentioned, for an international human rights court, where we would be able to bring the states and the companies, because we know at the national level it's very difficult to get justice in many cases, not in all the cases. So if we would have the possibility to have decisions of judges which we could enforce, coming from the international level, that would support the victims, because on the end, all that is really to support people suffering on hunger or malnutrition. And normally, this hunger and malnutrition is not because people are lazy or because they grew up in this or that region, but really because of relations of power, and we have to try to correct to different mechanisms that we are developing. I know it's not a really easy task, but other ways it would not be a task.
There are some things you have to do, whether it's easy or not. And we'll come to Dr. Keshab.
Yeah.
There are enough experts who say that food problem is because we're not growing enough. But there are some who say that we're growing enough food to feed the entire population on this planet.
Yeah.
How can there be two different views about the same thing? Population is same. Probably food production is at least it's
same.
measurable.
Yeah.
So how can we have two views?
The easiest way to understand is that that agriculture or food producing as a livelihood pattern or as a profit making. If you go on the multinational agribusiness organizations and big, large farmers, commercialization of farming and commercialization of the life-sustaining food items, which sustains the life of a human being, it is compared with these mobiles and cars and this all that. That's quite different. So if you do not commercialize the things, commercialize your view, then you see that the food production is enough. Because every people have their own geographical background, they have their own biodiversity-based resources which can produce the locally sufficient food to them. So if you think that the what you call that monoculture, monoculture of food, wherever you go you should have dinner, wherever you go you should have lunch in that pattern, and that packet, a set of foods there are, this and that item, then there is a scarcity of food. But if you believe in the diversity of human environment, natural environment and cultural environment, and the food beauty of variety of foods, you know, so one intellectual that the accommodation is that if given these resources, we can feed till it is beyond 12 billion.
So
We are 7 billion.
We're still in surplus.
Yeah,
and
we
I'll
are
come
quite
to you.
sufficient.
Why are we not understanding that there's enough food? Why are we trying to
I
commercialize?
think we don't want to understand, especially those making business of food. Because when we talk about food, we talk about food having an economic dimension, but also a cultural and a social dimension, which means, for example, when you produce food, you meet with your partners in the fields, or you go to the market, or the mother feeds the baby, and all that creates social cohesion and reflects cultural patterns. But when you just think in food as business, it is good to say that food is not enough, because then you can justify what you're doing, and you can play with prices.
But the point is, there is enough food for everyone on this planet.
It's what the FAO is saying, the international organization.
Let's accept to that, and hopefully the world becomes free of hunger.
Thank you
very
very
much.
much.
Is respected. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Sure.
That was Dr. Anna Maria and Dr. Keshab Khadka. We talked about people's right to food and food security issues. Keep watching Kandipur Television. Thanks for watching so far.